Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this 100th episode, we talk people, tech and ops with CAS.
I describe the RAF as the country's first responder. But that's got to be our focus over the next few years, is get the most out of what we've got and make sure it keeps up with the enemy. Right now, every element of the Air Force is involved in operations in some way. And that's just the deploy stuff. I've not even talked about at home maritime patrol aircraft, QRA, the team at RAF Boomer, the team from Lima who are out in the Middle East doing ground-based air defence.
Also, in this episode, we'll reheat a few stories just in case you missed them, and we'll be finding out who is under the hat this week.
What's your profession?
I'm a pilot and I'm based at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire, where I'm part of the Red Arrows.
Find out who is under the hat at the end of this episode. Now, this is the 100th episode of Inside Air, and we thought we'd like to take a look at some of the significant events and achievements that have happened for the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations since the very first episode back in January 2021. And we'd also like to take a look ahead to what we can expect in the Royal Air Force by episode 200, which we expect will be sometime between June and July 2028. To help us do this, we're joined today by Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton. Thank you very much for coming back on to Inside Air.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Peter. Thanks very much. Now, before we get going, though, I need you to tell me a little bit about how this started back in 2021. What was... You've been involved in it all the way since then. I've not been back in Air Command for some time. So how did it start?
Oh, okay. Right. It wasn't 2021. It wasn't even 2020. It was 2017.
Oh, wow.
So I happened to find myself on a course where I got inspired. You go on courses, you get inspired. I thought, the Royal Air Force really needs a podcast. And I pitched it through to my chain of command, who were really busy. And they said, come back another day. I came back another day in 2018. They said, seriously, come back another day, because it was RAF 100. But I wrote the plans anyhow. I think it was summertime 2020.
So COVID time.
Middle of COVID.
Yeah.
You know, normally in the media world, we used to send out camera teams to do news stuff and it would appear on YouTube, but we couldn't do that. So the alternative is audio, which could be done remotely. And someone somewhere in one of these big buildings said podcast. Someone else said, oh, Pete Lisney has been trying to sort out a podcast. And so I got the phone call and we started, worked closely with the Air Media and Comms team and pulled together the media reservists. And a little secret, we didn't actually launch in 2021. We did a silent launch on Christmas Eve 2020. No one knew about it.
Well, you can't have a silent podcast. Of course nobody knew about it.
Well, I wanted to make sure that the tech actually worked. And we planned, we would say, right, 12th of January is the day that we tell the world. But it had already been out for a couple of weeks, but no one had seen it.
Well, that's brilliant. I'm really glad really glad you've done it. It's such a brilliant opportunity for people who are outside of the Air Force kind of core issues and to learn a bit more about what's going on. I know you're the face of it, but I can't imagine that you do it entirely on your own, Peter, no matter how skilled you are. You must have a team around you that help as well.
Oh, it's an incredible team, and they're an absolute pleasure to work with because, well, the vast majority are reservists. Most of the team are reservists, and that means they've got full-time civilian jobs. They're radio presenters, journalists. One of the guys works on TV as a producer. Right. And if you think this job is pressured, you ought to have a chat to him about his day job. Do you know what? I'm going to give a shout out because...
Yeah, please do. No, please do.
Yeah, our audience would have heard these names before, but we should recognise them. Flight Lieutenant Chris Sully, you hear him. We flip-flop who does the presenting. Flight Attendant Amy Casey, AS1 Simon Ross, who's since retired from the Royal Air Force, but he delivered I'll Name That Noise segment when we got started. AS1 Vic Andrews doing the news alongside Emma Kerwin, who also presents, and Chris Keane, AS2 Chris Keane, one of our newest guys. Ben Russell, AS1 Ben Russell. There's a theme here, isn't there? They're AS1s, and these guys, you wouldn't believe what they do in their civvy jobs. Wing Commander Stu Smith, he and I worked very closely at the very start of this, so we owe a lot to him. And Corporal Chris Richards, I don't know if he's still a corporal, RAF Music Services, did our theme music. Ben Young did our logo. Yeah. And
that's great.
And there's loads of other people that have contributed with episodes. Yeah. It's also, sorry.
Well, from me, certainly a big thank you to everybody who's involved in the project and what you do, because I think lots and lots of people enjoy it and find it really valuable. You only have to look at the listener numbers to see that. So yeah, thank you to you, Peter, and for the team for what you've done over the last 3 years, and 3.5 years as it turns out.
Thank you. The tagline of Inside Air is a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. And as I said at the start, it would be great to have a look at how we've come through the last 3.5 years or so. What has changed in the Royal Air Force? So I'm going to bang the tennis ball over to you, sir, and I just want to see what comes to mind for you. So what has the Royal Air Force achieved in the people area? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so when I started, I talked about my priorities being operational mindset, people and infrastructure. Well, that's because in my mind, the Air Force exists to be ready to fly and fight, and you only do that if you've got people who've got the right operational mindset and they feel as though they're being appropriately looked after. The thing that bothers me most right now is that we've seen that numbers are falling and have been falling since probably 2022 post-COVID. And so that's one of the negatives, I think, right now, and that's why people is such a big focus for me, and to kind of really work hard to ensure that as we look forward to in 4 years' time into 2028, that the Air Force is bigger than it is today, quite a bit bigger than it is today. And there's no one thing that's going to do that. It's about recruitment, but as I say to people all the time, it starts with retention. I'm struck so often when I go around the Air Force by the quality of the people we have. And one of the great things about this job is this opportunity to go and visit bits of the Air Force that I don't know very much about. I went to RF Boomer a few weeks ago. I was chatting to a young AS1 there who effectively flies the Red Air for training the controllers, and I sort of joked with him. I said, I bet you practice in your room at night, don't you? He said, no, I do actually, sir. So he's studying Russian fighter tactics so he can be better at his job. And I see that kind of stuff all over the Air Force, and that kind of quality, that professionalism, that determination to do a good job, and the joy of it is massively motivating, and I want to make sure that we all feel that. So that's where why it's important, where we need to go in terms of changes. And there's quite a lot changed actually. I started back at Air Command about 2 and a bit years ago, and right in the middle of the rollout of professions. I mean, that's enormous. That's taken from 65 trades down to 11 professions, readying us for the kind of flexibility that we'll need for the future. That's a massive thing that's changed. I also sometimes reflect on this air-base air-wing model, the operating model it sometimes gets called, or the Wittering model as it sometimes gets called. In some respects, that's probably the most significant organisational change in the Air Force since perhaps the end of the Second World War.
It's really interesting, because I don't think people outside of the our veterans, if they're listening to this today, they wouldn't have been exposed to the information on that, because it's been kept very internal, but not for any bad reason. It's just probably not that exciting to people outside. But for the benefit of our veterans, what's changed? What is the Wittering model?
So basically, what it does is it separates out the air wing, which is the element that will deploy and fight, if it were to deploy from the air base, which is the bit that supports and generates it. Now, as we think about the future, we've got to be ready to fight the base, as well as we've got to be able to force generate the teeth that we're going to employ against the enemy. So what it means in some places is we've got wing commanders, station commanders at units before. And I'll be honest with you, when I came back to Air Command in 2022, I didn't really understand it. I'd not listened to the InsideAIR podcast, if there had been one. I'm not sure
there wasn't. No, this is what I mean. It's quiet.
And I kind of thought, well, how's this going to work? What you've lost the single station commander who she or he then has responsibility for balancing all of those demands, both the operating demand and the support elements. And then I had a bit of a word with myself, because when I was a station commander at Wittering in 2009, 10, 11, we had the Harrier force there, which was actually commanded by Gary Waterfall, who was the station commander at Cottesmore, and my job was to make sure the station, air traffic control and all those bits worked in order for his Harriers to operate from the base. And I went, that is the airbase air wing model. I mean, funny old thing, that's why it's called the Wittering model.
The Wittering model.
And so that was good for me to go back over that and think, actually, that worked really well. Now, it depended on a good relationship, but it did mean that we could concentrate on different things. And that's what we're starting to see with this airbase air wing model. And what I found as I've gone around the Air Force is, before it gets introduced, people are kind of really unsure. Once it's been introduced and you go through a cycle where all of the command team over 2 years has moved on, to anybody coming in, it's just, that's the way it's always been done as far as they're concerned. The general feedback actually from commanders and I has been really very good. I'm conscious it does complicate some things, but I said when I took over as chief, I'm not going to reverse that. We're kind of committed to this, and let's see this through, and let's see it settle and see how it plays out. And as I say, the general consensus from those I speak to, I'm not sure everybody agree with it, is that actually it's really helping to drive focus and clarity on those particular areas.
Can I ask, the creation of global enablement, which I think was at the latter part of 2022, did that come from the same stable, the same idea house for the Wittering model?
I actually don't know, because it was decision to do that was before my time as AMP or as CAS, but it is but I suspect it did come out of the same kind of level of thing. It was part of that rethink of the operational model and rebrigading of command of those elements that might deploy to enable the Air Force on a global basis. And actually, I see when I talk to Jamie Thompson, who's the one-star, just how much value there is in having that a single organisation to look at all of those components, because you need all of those bits to actually make an operation work.
So what have we done for our people in terms of personal development? What programmes have come in?
Well, probably the most significant is the RAF Lead programme, which was part of the RAF talent strategy that was published, I think, in 2020. And the RAF Lead is a voluntary 12-month programme which targeted at other ranks who've been identified by their chains of command as showing high potential for leadership responsibilities. And I've got the great privilege of meeting quite a few people on the scheme at various ranks, AS1 all the way up to senior NCO rank. And the idea is it exposes high potential future leaders to development opportunities in a focused way. And it's a programme and a cohort of people they can work with. And the idea is it increases the rate of people's development. And for me, leadership is such an important part of military life. And it's the leaders in an organisation that set the tone and create the culture. And it's if we do that right, that's when people feel valued. They feel like they want to work hard and stay in the organisation. And all of that's got to be good for the Air Force and making us a better organisation. So can claim no credit for RAF Lead. I've inherited it, but I think it's a really, really good scheme.
And will that find the aviator, or does the aviator have to put their hand up?
So a little bit of both, but ultimately it's the chain of command who identify on units those who they think have got that kind of potential, and it gives them the opportunities to develop, to be exposed to this development opportunity. And inevitably, I think what you see is people get excited and interested and motivated, and it makes them do even better and exposes them to things that perhaps they might have been exposed to in their career at some point, but this just is accelerated and focused. So I think it's a really good scheme.
Okay, sounds good. And will that be continuing on? Is that going to get better?
Yeah, it definitely will continue. I think it's an important component of it. We've got some work to do, I think, we're going to review, and part of a kind of routine review of AP 7001, which is RF leadership. Make sure that that's fit for the Air Force that we need to be and the future, and a real focus on making sure that we use the right tools and lead people in the right way and create that kind of inclusive culture, that sense of teamwork, which is what really high-performing organisations have. And if we get that right, that then flows through into the teaching that we see as people go through courses and get part of the lead programme and other things like that.
If you serve in the Royal Air Force, you know retention is not brilliant at the moment. It would be good to know from your perspective what we as a Royal Air Force are doing about it.
Yeah, retention, workforce numbers, people, that is the thing I worry about most, I think about most, talk about most. And as ever with these things, there's no one thing that's going to solve that problem. We've got to go after lots and lots of aspects around the offer, lived experience, all those kind of things. But what I always say is that we retain people one person at a time. So all of us who are in leadership roles with leadership responsibility have got a job to do to create an environment where people feel heard and valued, and where they have the opportunity to enjoy the unique experiences that life in the military, and particularly life in the Air Force, can offer. And so I'll do my very best to work on the big things, like convince politicians about pay and financial retention incentives and how we organise ourselves and take away some of those frictions that we've talked about in terms of bureaucracy and policies that are unnecessarily bureaucratic, like things like annual training requirements, reducing those down, applying common sense. I can do those big things, but what all of us have got a job to do in the service is to create that atmosphere where people want to work, where they understand what they do, why they do it is important, and we give them the support they need to develop. That's what makes being in the military special, and that's that kind of teamwork, if we create, that will help us along the way.
Interesting. Yeah, it's the Air Force doesn't speak, does it? It's people within the Air Force speak.
Absolutely right.
Whether that's at your level, crikey, when you speak, people should listen and take notice. But it's got to filter down to every single level, hasn't it? When you're going to interact with someone, think about how are they going to respond to what you're just going to do to them.
Yeah. I mean, WORAF is really good on it. He says, when he was a junior, as a SAC as it was then, it was his senior NCO that really shaped the environment he was in, and sometimes for good and sometimes not for good. And we've all got that opportunity influence if we're in leadership and supervisory responsibilities, and all of us have a role to play, therefore, in creating that atmosphere, the kind of atmosphere where we would want to be. And if we get that right, then we'll be flying.
Thinking forward then, for the people side of the Royal Air Force, how do you see things going over the next 4 years?
So as I said a moment ago, for me, the workforce, people numbers and people's kind of attitudes towards the service are so important to our ability to fly and fight. And what I want to see over the next few years is the workforce growing again. What I want to see is continuing to offer people the unique opportunities that life in the service can give you. So I'm really I really prioritise things like sport and adventurous training, the force development activity, and there's no question. I got a few months ago, I got the team to look at what the participation rates had been over the last sort of 5-6 years, and what you saw is, not surprisingly, in 2020 during COVID, participation rates in sport and adventurous training kind of dropped off a cliff, almost to zero, as you would expect. But what was also interesting is they didn't pick up that quickly after COVID was over. It seemed to take time for the numbers to go back up. But I'm really pleased to say that the numbers I looked at from the end of the last financial year is participation rates in sport and adventurous training are now at or above the levels they were in 2019. So I think that's a positive thing, particularly given, and we'll talk about operations in a minute, how busy the operations have been, but also the challenges around workforce. We've got to, as leaders and commanders, continue to make time for those things that make life in the service different.
Fun.
Yeah, it's about having fun.
Fly and fight, brackets, fun.
Yeah, look. I mean, some people at IoT, I speak to every IoT, every IOD course, every HMLC course. It's not called that
So that's
anymore.
all our new
training for our warrant officers, training for our junior officers and squadron leaders, and training for our senior officers, and training for our juniors coming through. I speak to all of them. One of the things I always say is that nobody wants to work for a miserable and so you have to...
We might have to bleep that.
I don't think so.
Okay.
But, if you're in an organisation where you feel passionate about what the organisation does, you feel as though you've got a key role to play, that you're heard and you're valued, that's going to make you a better team player, and ultimately that's going to make the organisation better, and we owe it to the country to do that. And part of that is make sure people have time to build those relationships and have fun, and I want to continue to do that in my time as chief, and as we looked out to 2028 to ensure that those opportunities are there for our people and we are able to enjoy them and be better aviators as a consequence.
Super. The other burning question is infrastructure, accommodation, that sort of thing. Yeah,
so as I said, people, infrastructure, those are, alongside that operational mindset, were right at the top of my priority list. And some of the listeners will have heard me say this before, but fundamentally, we have not invested enough in infrastructure over a long period of time. It's well acknowledged by ministers and by senior leaders. And when in 2018 responsibility for infrastructure was delegated back to the single services, back to the commands, our forward programme of infrastructure, which was in 2018, our forward programme of infrastructure in 2018 over 10 years was worth about £3 billion. Today, our forward programme over 10 years is worth about £7+ billion. And I can claim no credit for that work. That was my two predecessors who recognised this was a problem, and they prioritised funding, actually generally away from our equipment, in order to invest in infrastructure. What I've said is I will continue with that prioritisation, but in the same way that it's taken 2 chiefs to get it to me, it's going to take 2-3 chiefs before we really see that affect the whole of the infrastructure. But you can go to places like Lossiemouth, go to Marham, go to Coningsby. You can see this infrastructure that was where the money was identified years ago, literally coming out of the ground. We've still got a long way to go, and we've still got to stay focused on it and relentlessly prioritise investment in those things. But I hope by 2028 we increasingly see the benefits of that, whether it's in aircraft operating services, whether it's in our technical accommodation, or actually in things like SLA, and actually improvements in SFA as well.
I guess, the families accommodation and singlies accommodation. With that, I guess what you can see is the direction of travel, even if you can't see the end result yet. You can certainly see where we're going. Yeah,
and it's going to require constant prioritisation and constant focus from me and our ministers and others in the wider organisation. But I'm determined to keep at it and keep focused on it, so that in 2028 people will look back and go, yeah, that we made the right calls in 2023, 2024.
Let's talk about technology. And we've retired a few aircraft types since 2021, and we've introduced aircraft types and plenty of other tech. Let's have a look at that.
Yeah, so I think that the Air Force actually is in a very fortunate position in lots of ways, in that most of apart from the rotary wing world, where I learnt the other day that Puma is now came into service in 1971, so it's kind of 53 years old, so that's definitely been around quite a long time. But most of the stuff we operate in the Air Force has come into service in the last 10 years. We're celebrating 10 years of Atlas coming into service. We've got Typhoon Tranche 2 and 3, F-35, P-8, all of these things have come into service in the last few years. So we're very fortunate in the Air Force to have been, well, the term is recapitalised over the last few years. And what we've seen is a whole bunch of stuff retired. So E3's gone out of service, C-130 out of service, Hawk T1 in its aggressor role has gone out of service, Sentinel gone out of service. But what we've got now, plus E7 and Protector, the replacement for Reaper coming into service next year, that's pretty much what we're going to have for the next few years. And actually, as I look around European air forces in NATO, that's the most modern air force in NATO. My American counterpart looks with envy at the modern elements of our fleet, of our forces. But what that does mean is, because the next big investments in GCAP, the Global Combat Air Programme, or Future Combat Air System as it's sometimes described, we're not going to see that till the end of the 2030s. Our job right now, over the next few years, is to make the stuff that we've got, this modern equipment, work really well and get the most out of it, but also kind of spirally develop it.
Okay.
And I'm sure you'll ask me about where that's going to go, but that's got to be our focus over the next few years: is get the most out of what we've got and make sure it keeps up with the enemy. So
you're saying that the train set is complete at the moment?
Yeah, largely. Yeah, largely.
Okay. You mentioned spiral there. What does that mean? That's to do with procurement, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think if as I project to the future, what are the big trends in technology that are going to make a difference to us and air power? And the first thing I'd point to is space. So we are going to see increasingly, as the cost of launch and the miniaturization, so the cost of launch goes down, miniaturization of equipment, we're going to see increasingly things that we do in the atmosphere today move to space. So Sentinel gave us ground moving target information, indication, and actually ultimately I think that's going to get done from space. Same ultimately with air moving target indication. E7 may well be the last air-breathing, airborne early warning platform that we buy, because by the time we get into the 2040s, that's almost certainly going to be done from space. So we're going to see increasingly things move to space, which does mean actually we need to protect and defend space.
I was just going to ask, what if space is denied?
Yeah, and I think there's two parts to that. One is we need to protect and defend space, and I've made this point at the space conference and the like. But also we need to think cleverly about how you make these things resilient, and some of that's going to be a mix of air-breathing, land-based and space-based capabilities, which kind of leads me on to the other three big areas of technology that I think are going to make a difference. And the next is digital. And how do you connect these things together? How do you exploit the tools that we're seeing in financial technology or in artificial intelligence tools that are available to us over the internet? How do we apply those in a military domain? And part of the way in which we might spirally develop some of our capabilities is through the exploitation of digital technology. Very closely aligned to that, I think, is going to be increasing use of the synthetic environment We're used to it in flying training. I think that's kind of probably reached its limit. But it's about how we bring lots of elements together. How do we train with the Army, with the Navy, with space and cyber and Air Force together? And Gladiator, which is this multi-domain environment, synthetic environment up at Waddington, that does that, and we're going to see more and more of that, and you link that to digitals. And then the final thing is, I think we've seen in Nagorno-Karabakh, we've seen in Ukraine, we've seen in the Middle East to some extent, just how important uncrewed systems, drones, autonomous collaborative platforms, as we call them in the surf, those are going to become increasingly prevalent. We're going to see more and more of them. And if I think about the next 4 years, well, by the end of this financial year, we will have in service a usable, operationally useful capability of a drone that will fly alongside Typhoon and F-35 or ahead of them, helping to suppress enemy air defences and improving the lethality and survivability. And that those numbers are only going to grow over the next few years. So that's how we take what we've already got and make it better by exploiting these technologies to deliver a more operationally effective Air Force.
With the developments that we've had, or the way that we operate, we're very good at operating with our allies and partners, with NATO, within NATO, fighting alongside, or training to fight alongside. What are we doing to work on the ground-based servicing, the real true interoperability with our NATO allies?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Some have heard me say, I think we have the best European Air Force in NATO in terms of our capability, but I'm very conscious that how we get more out of what we've got is how do we is by better interaction with our NATO partners and allies. Big piece of work on NATO cross-servicing. When I joined back in the 1990s, you could have an F-16 from Holland, from the Netherlands, come and land at RAF Coningsby, and our visiting aircraft team knew how to service that, turn it around, get it off again. We've lost all of that post the end of the Cold War, so it's about getting those things back. And as I think about the future and where I would prioritise investment, I talk about people and infrastructure, but next on my list is enablers. These things that might be a little bit unseen, that will really allow us to get more out of what we've got. It's things like ground support equipment. It's things like air cargo handling equipment, which is older than I am at Bryce Dalton. These sorts of things can make a really big difference. So we need to do that at home, but actually, as we think about agile combat employment and moving around NATO in order to avoid being targeted by Russia if we end up in a fight, we need to be able to do that with our allies. We need to have them here. We need to be able to get there. And so there's quite a lot of focus, I think, over the next 4 years on how we really make ACE a thing that we can actually do rather than just talk about.
And that I've got to say, that's got to start with our defence suppliers, the contractors, in producing the equipment that is serviceable across multiple nations, presumably. Yeah,
so there's a bit of a tendency to perhaps question whether industry can step up or to criticise industry. But my experience has been throughout my career is that when we really need them, industry are there and they will step up. And I've got multiple examples of that over the last 30 odd years. But where we are as an Air Force is we are completely reliant on industry to provide us with the equipment, the support, the spares. And so this isn't about us going back to a time when we did it all ourselves. This is about us working together as we look to the future. And when I talk to industry players about things like agile combat employment, I was up at Shawbury recently, and they're really eager to get involved and get stuck in, and they feel that kind of same passion we do for the job that we've got as an Air Force. They want to protect the country and help protect our families and our interests around the world. It won't be free, let's be honest about it. They've got to make a profit, but we can't deliver air and space power. We can't be ready to fly and fight without the involvement of industry, and so we've got to see this as a team game. and work hard together to enhance that capability and deliver what the country needs.
So we've talked about the people, we've talked about the technology, and that always leads to the operational, ready to fly and fight. Could you tell us about the operations that we've been involved in since InsideAIR got off the ground?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I describe the RAF as the country's first responder, government's first responder in terms of crisis around the world. And that's because of the inherent speed and flexibility of air power. But we think back to, we've had Op Shader has been running since 2014. It's 10 years that's been running, and the UK and particularly the Air Force has played a central role in that. We had Op Pitting, of course, where I think all of us will remember the kind of harrowing scenes at Kabul and at other air bases around Afghanistan, which the Air Force was at the heart of. Polar Bear in Sudan, where largest evacuation of British nationals, certainly in my career, and I think somewhat longer. We've seen with Russia's aggression in Ukraine, increasing focus on NATO air policing, Azatars, Biloxi, the F-35's recently been to Iceland under Mastra. Yeah, and then there's Ukraine, where the UK and the Air Force in particular was helping ensure that before the war we were able to fly stuff into the region to get it into Ukraine so they could defend themselves against the attack that did come from Russia. And I think the work that we did as an Air Force definitely will have played a part, and is today playing a part, in making sure that Ukraine stays in the fight and is able to face down Russian aggression. We've seen the situation in the Middle East get increasingly difficult. Houthis attacking defenceless commercial shipping running through the Red Sea there, and us alongside our international allies taking proportionate, precise action in a professional way to limit their ability to do those things. So, yeah, ultimately what we're about is being ready to fly and fight in order to protect our country, our families, and our interests around the world. And the Air Force absolutely has been right at the heart of that over the last, certainly since the podcast started, and I would argue for quite a lot longer. And every element, and it's interesting, right now, every element of the Air Force is involved in operations in some way. And that's just the deploy stuff. I've not even talked about at home maritime patrol aircraft, QRA, the team at RAF Boomer, the team from Leeming who are out in the Middle East doing ground-based air defence. All of these folks are critical to supporting, protecting UK interests. And we all know how busy the helicopter force has been over many, many years. And so all of the Air Force has played a massive part in that.
So I think looking forward, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, doesn't it, with security. Maybe you can't tell us what operations are coming, but maybe you can tell us about operations that will be continuing.
If we think about where we are today and think about the future, we can't predict what operations are going to come. That's why we constantly need to be ready. But what is really clear is the world has become a more dangerous and unstable place. Our current Prime Minister, our previous Prime Minister are both on record as saying that. And I think that the call on the military instrument, armed forces, is likely to grow. And the Air Force, as the first responder and critical to offering our politicians choice about how to employ military effects around the world, is going to be right at the heart of that. And so our ability to be ready to project force, but also, and this is a big difference to where we've been over most of my career, actually, certainly the last 20 years, our ability to defend the UK, to be ready to defend and demonstrate that we can defend the UK in order to deter principally Russia from doing something daft, that is going to be of increasing importance over the next few years. We get that right, and we will, I'm sure, continue to be able to. We will continue to be asked to go and do operations around the globe. But that's why we're sort of shifting our focus a little bit onto Homeland Defence, Agile Combat Employment, and how we will protect the UK against aggression in Europe and in NATO.
So is the Air Force in a good place today?
Hey, look, I've said since I started, there's lots for us to be really proud of. We've got amazing people who can do amazing things, who are deeply passionate about what they do and extremely professional. We've had this investment in the Air Force in terms of new kit and equipment, which makes us the most modern we've ever been. But also we've got to be super realistic about some of the challenges we face, particularly about workforce and about our infrastructure. And one thing I've not talked about today is that, we've got some work to do on our processes and making attitude towards risk and making things a bit easier to do and more frictionless, and putting people at the heart of these things.
The red tape you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't like the term red tape challenge, because I've seen those come and go. It's about picking specific things that are out of date or slowing us down, and trying to get after those and fix them. Some of that is through the use of digital technology, and we haven't always got that right. The HR operating model and the regional centres relied on good technology, which we didn't get right. Now that's getting better. My objective there is to make sure that we have the technology works, that we can automate what we can automate, to free up our HR specialists who do a brilliant job to do the thing that they want to do and we want them to do, which is face-to-face conversations and solving problems, and automate all that nonsense in the same way as we have done in our personal lives. I haven't been into the bank for years, and we need that kind of level of quality of support, and I'm really told the team that's what we want to focus on, so that we can then free up these brilliant HR specialists to do the things that matter most to our people, which is helping them. And so that's the sort of thing that we need to get after.
Okay. Well, we started the podcast off talking about the people, technology and operations. We've reflected on what's gone in the last few years, talked about what may be round the corner. Finally, the chances are there's someone listening to this episode today that could be the very first episode that they're listening to of Inside Air. What message do you have for them about listening to this podcast?
Good question. So it's very easy in all of our careers to get narrowly focused on our unit, our section, the things that we do. There's 30,000 odd people in the Air Force, and we do a very broad range of things. And here I am as a chief, 30 odd years since I joined, still learning things about what goes on in the Air Force. And what Inside Air gives you is that much broader view. And I always encourage people to be curious about the organisation and curious about the world. And through that, anybody who's listened to this for the first time is be curious. Enjoy the breadth of the Air Force, and you never know, it might open up opportunities for you that you hadn't realised were there, and might open doors to a future that is even more exciting than one that you think you're going to have.
Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and thank you for being on Inside Air.
Peter, it's a great pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity, but also thank you for all of your work over the last 99 episodes to get us here today. It's a really great resource, and I know very popular amongst people and makes a big difference, so thank you.
Thank you.
This is Reheat for Inside Air, where we take a look at some of the RAF stories you may have missed. I'm AS2 Chris Keane. The RAF's Wedgetail E7 aircraft has taken its first test flight from Birmingham Airport. It's the most technologically advanced airborne early warning and control system available, and will provide UK defence with eyes in the sky. Squadron Leader Ronan Carey, Media and Engagement Lead for the E7 Wedgetail programme, was there to watch it take off.
Today's milestone was a long time coming. It's been a massive team effort, both within the programme, with our stakeholders at STS, Boeing and Defence Equipment and Support. This cutting-edge aircraft is an important iStar asset, and it will continue its testing into next year, and the RAF looks forward to it entering operational service soon.
The Red Arrows have successfully completed their tour of Canada as part of Exercise Maple Hawk. They were marking their 60th display season, as well as celebrating the Royal Canadian Air Force centenary. Over 120 RAF personnel were detached as part of the 5-week exercise, which saw several flypasts, 4 air shows and multiple public engagements. The RAF have concluded a major exercise with the United States Air Force based in the UK to test joint readiness to fly and fight using agile combat employment tactics. Aircraft and ground crews dispersed from their main operating bases to unfamiliar locations with reduced levels of support. And finally, 700 paratroopers from 8 NATO nations recreated the Second World War airborne invasion of the Nazi-occupied Netherlands to commemorate the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. An RAF A400M carried British Army paratroopers to Ginkle Heath drop zone, where their counterparts would have landed 80 years ago. A highlight of the drop was the use of 8 specially designed Poppy parachutes, as well as the iconic Lancaster bomber from the RAF's Battle of Britain memorial flight flying overhead. And that was Reheat for Inside Air.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
My name is Flight Lieutenant Patrick Kershaw, and I am known as Paddy.
What's your profession?
I'm a pilot, and I'm based at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire, where I'm part of the Red Arrows.
What's the best thing about your job?
The best part of my job is definitely getting to travel to lots of different places and meet lots of different people.
Hardest part of your job?
So the hardest part of my job is definitely then all that travelling means away from home a lot.
Best location you've served?
Probably Nellis Air Force Base. Exercise Red Flag in Nevada in the United States. Really good exercise, really high end, getting lots of Typhoon aircraft, fighting with the Americans against lots of other aircraft as well.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
The bit of kit I wouldn't deploy without is my service iPad. It's got 4-flight on. It allows me to get from A to B on time for displays and flypasts.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
Definitely taking part in the Queen's Jubilee flypast in 2022 over London. Real privilege and really great thing to be involved with.
Thank you, Flight Lieutenant Kershaw, for helping us to put on a fantastic display on this episode of Under the Hat.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.